Okay, so you want to buy a hospital. On paper, this looks like the safest bet in the entire American economy. Think about it. A restaurant needs you to be hungry and in the mood. A hotel needs you to be traveling. A hospital just needs you to be a human being, because sooner or later, every single person on earth ends up on one of these beds. Guaranteed demand, no marketing required. No competitor can ever make people stop getting sick. So, why are hospitals collapsing into bankruptcy right now faster than almost any other point in decades? Why did one of the largest hospital bankruptcies in American history happen just last year? And how does a business with guaranteed customers every day, forever, end up with unpaid staff, repossessed medical equipment, and a dead patient, while the man in charge is buying himself a yacht? By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how that happens. And you'll understand why, of all the businesses on this channel, this might be the darkest one yet. Let's start with how this industry was actually built, because the story is stranger than you'd expect. In 1968, a Nashville cardiologist named Thomas Frist Sr., his son, and a local businessman named Jack Massey looked at a single 200-bed hospital and asked a question nobody in American medicine had really asked before. What if you ran a hospital exactly like a business and scaled it like one? They called the company Hospital Corporation of America. In 1968, it made $29 million. By 1980, it was making over $1 billion a year. Today, that same company, now called HCA Healthcare, is projected to bring in as much as $76.5 billion a year. That's not a typo. One company now accounts for something like 5 to 6% of all healthcare spending in the entire United States. Hospitals stopped being just places you go when you're sick. They became one of the most reliable revenue machines in the country. But before we get to how you'd buy in today, you need to hear what happened the first time this business model got tested against its own greed, because it's one of the wildest stories in corporate America, and almost nobody remembers it. In 1987, a young executive named Rick Scott co-founded a hospital company called Columbia. Over the next decade, he bought up hundreds of hospitals, surgery centers, and home health agencies, eventually merging with HCA itself to create the largest for-profit hospital chain the country had ever seen. Then, in March 1997, FBI agents, IRS investigators, and federal health inspectors raided company facilities across the country, seizing records from hospitals in Texas and beyond. What they found was staggering. Columbia had been systematically overbilling Medicare and Medicaid, inflating the seriousness of patient diagnoses to squeeze out bigger reimbursements, and paying doctors illegal kickbacks in exchange for patient referrals. Scott was pressured to resign within months, walking away with nearly $10 million in cash and stock worth over $300 million more. The company eventually pleaded guilty to 14 felony counts and paid $1.7 billion in fines, at the time, the largest healthcare fraud settlement in American history. Here's the twist that makes this story worth telling. Rick Scott was never personally charged with a crime. When later asked under oath about the fraud that happened on his watch, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination 75 separate times. And instead of that being the end of his career, it was closer to the beginning of a new one. Scott went on to spend tens of millions of his own fortune running for governor of Florida, and won. Years later, he was elected to the United States Senate, where he now votes on national healthcare policy for over 300 million Americans. The man at the center of the largest Medicare fraud case in American history is currently one of the people writing the rules for the rest of the industry. Keep that story in your back pocket. You're going to want it later. So how do you actually buy your way into this business today? You could try building a hospital from scratch, but in most states, that's nearly impossible. Strict certificate of need laws mean you often need government permission just to open. These laws exist in roughly 36 states, originally designed decades ago to stop hospitals from overbuilding and driving up costs through unnecessary competition. In practice, they now function as a moat protecting whoever already owns the hospitals in a given region. An existing operator can formally object to a new entrant's application, and regulators frequently side with them. So the fastest way into this industry was never construction. It was acquisition. You could buy shares in a giant like HCA and own a sliver of the whole machine. Or, and this is the lane almost the entire modern industry actually runs on, you go bargain hunting. You buy a struggling hospital system through a private equity roll-up. Real numbers, same as always. On the small end, a rural hospital coming out of bankruptcy can go for as little as $26 million. That's what one investment firm paid for a regional hospital in Arizona back in 2018. On the large end, a multi-hospital system can run closer to $1 billion. Cerberus Capital Management bought a 6-hospital Massachusetts system for nearly $900 million in 2010 and only had to put up about a quarter of that in actual cash. Here's the part that explains everything else in this video: the actual engine. Remember the casino episode, House Edge, guaranteed math on every single bet? Hospitals have their own version of that guarantee, except it isn't a rigged wheel. It's the government. Medicare and Medicaid reimburse hospitals almost automatically for the patients who walk through the door. Patients don't get to shop around when they're having a heart attack. They can't negotiate. They can't walk away. That single fact, guaranteed non-negotiable demand, is exactly why private equity has poured something like $1 trillion into healthcare acquisitions since the early 2010s. It's the closest thing to a sure bet that exists anywhere in American business. But here's where it gets interesting. Because guaranteed demand doesn't mean guaranteed profit for the hospital. It means guaranteed cash flow that somebody, somewhere, can find a way to extract. This is the single most important mechanism in the entire episode, so pay attention, because it's the reason almost every hospital collapse you're about to hear follows the exact same shape. It's called a sale-leaseback. Here's how it works. You buy the hospital. Building, land, equipment, everything. Then you split the real estate into a separate company. You sell that real estate, just the building and the land, to a landlord, often a specialized real estate investment trust built exactly for this. That sale generates an enormous upfront payday, and then the hospital itself signs a lease, agreeing to pay rent every single month, forever, just to keep operating inside the building it used to own. You've just turned an asset into a bill. The hospital gets a mountain of cash on day one, and in exchange it now owes rent permanently, on top of everything it already had to pay just to run an actual hospital: staff, equipment, supplies, insurance. If the hospital was tight on margin before, this doesn't fix that. It just moves the problem downstream and hands the cash to whoever owned it first. Watch how fast this plays out in real life. A hospital in Arizona was bought out of bankruptcy for $26 million in 2018. 3 years later, in 2021, its real estate alone sold separately for $60 million, more than double what the whole hospital had cost. By 2022, the hospital was closed. The owners didn't lose money on this deal. The building did more work for them dead than alive. And this trick isn't limited to hospitals, by the way. Look at what the same playbook does inside a nursing home, where the outcome is even more measurable. Researchers analyzing over 7 million Medicare patients found that after a private equity buyout, a nursing home's average lease payments jumped by 75%, largely because of this exact same sale-leaseback structure. Cash on hand inside these facilities drops by nearly 40%. Staffing gets cut to compensate. And the result, according to the same study, is a 10% increase in patient mortality, translating to more than 20,000 additional deaths across the industry over the study period. That's over 1,000 extra deaths a year, on average, from a financial structure, not a medical one. Now for the story that made this entire industry a national headline, and the reason we're making this video in the first place. In 2010, private equity giant Cerberus Capital Management bought a struggling Catholic hospital system in Massachusetts and renamed it Steward Healthcare. Over the next several years, Steward grew aggressively, eventually running 36 hospitals across multiple states. In 2016, Steward pulled the sale-leaseback trick at massive scale. It sold its hospital real estate to a landlord called Medical Properties Trust for over $1 billion. A large chunk of that money went straight into dividends for Cerberus and for Steward's own CEO. By the time Cerberus finally exited the company in 2020, it had very nearly quadrupled its original investment, walking away with a reported $800 million gain. Steward, meanwhile, was now locked into paying rent on hospitals it used to own outright, rent it increasingly couldn't afford. And the landlord on the other end of those leases wasn't just a passive collector of checks. As Steward's finances quietly deteriorated, Medical Properties Trust kept the full picture from its own investors, continuing to present the hospital chain as a healthy, profitable tenant, even as internal warning signs mounted. By the end of 2017 alone, Steward had already become MPT's single largest source of revenue. accounting for over a quarter of the landlord's total earnings, despite the fact that Stewart itself wasn't actually profitable. The landlord needed the tenant to look fine on paper for its own sake, which meant nobody with a clear financial picture had much incentive to sound the alarm early. Around the time of that 2016 deal, Stewart's CEO, a cardiac surgeon named Ralph de la Torre, personally received a $111 million dividend. Not long after, he bought himself a yacht, a $40 million yacht, then a second one. He also picked up 2 private jets and a private luxury suite at an NBA arena in Dallas. At one of his own hospitals during this same period, a new mother died from internal bleeding that doctors didn't catch in time because the equipment they needed had already been repossessed over unpaid bills. Same company, same years, a yacht on one side of the ledger, a death on the other. By May 2024, Stewart filed for bankruptcy, one of the largest hospital bankruptcies in decades. The numbers are staggering: over $9 billion in total liabilities, $290 million in unpaid wages and benefits owed to its own employees, nearly $1 billion owed to vendors and medical suppliers who had, in some cases, simply stopped shipping supplies because they hadn't been paid. Bankruptcy filings later accused De La Torre and other executives of misappropriating more than $245 million, money that vanished from a hospital system that couldn't pay its own nurses. And here's the part that turns this from a business story into a genuine showdown. The U.S. Senate subpoenaed De La Torre to testify about the collapse. He didn't show up. The Senate voted unanimously to hold him in contempt. His response? He sued the senators, claiming the subpoena violated his Fifth Amendment rights, and resigned as CEO days later. Notice something familiar there? Almost 30 years apart, 2 different hospital executives, in 2 completely different scandals, both reached for the exact same legal shield when the questions got uncomfortable. One of them ended up in the United States Senate anyway. If Stewart were the only story here, you could write it off as one greedy executive. It isn't. A landmark study published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, compared hospitals before and after private equity acquisitions. The results: a 25% overall increase in adverse events for patients, a 38% jump in dangerous bloodstream infections, a 27% rise in patient falls, all while these same hospitals were performing fewer procedures, not more. A separate study in 2025 found a 13% increase in emergency room deaths at hospitals following private equity takeovers. This isn't one bad actor. This is a repeatable, measurable pattern. Let's look at a completely different city, a completely different investor, and watch the exact same playbook run again. In 2018, a California investor named Joel Friedman bought Philadelphia's Hahnemann University Hospital, a 171-year-old safety net hospital that served mostly low-income, Black and Hispanic patients, for $170 million. Before he'd closed a single ward, he'd already split the hospital's real estate into a separate company. The following year, he shut Hahnemann down entirely. 2,500 union workers lost their jobs overnight. Tens of thousands of patients lost access to their hospital. And Friedman began pursuing plans to redevelop the prime downtown real estate into luxury condos and hotels. Bernie Sanders showed up outside the hospital to protest. Someone eventually spray-painted "Joel Kills" across the front of Friedman's own house. And here's the punchline nobody expected. By his own account, Friedman lost at least $10 million on the whole deal. The real estate sat tangled in bankruptcy court for 6 years. A 2025 bid for what remained of the property came in at just over $16 million, a fraction of what the luxury condo plan was supposed to deliver. Nobody actually got rich off this one. The hospital just died anyway for nothing. One more example, quickly, to show you this isn't a coincidence. Private equity firm Leonard Green owned a hospital system called Prospect Medical Holdings, which ran a network including Crozer Health in Pennsylvania. When Leonard Green exited its investment in 2021, an official investigation found the ownership group had walked away with roughly $437 million in profit, leaving the hospital system drowning in debt behind them. Crozer Health collapsed into bankruptcy and shut its doors in 2025. Zoom all the way out, and here's where the industry actually stands right now. As of 2025, at least 488 hospitals across the United States are owned by private equity firms. Nearly 28% of them serve rural communities, exactly the places with the fewest other options when a hospital disappears. Texas has more private equity-owned hospitals than any other state, with over 100. New Mexico has the highest proportion of any state. More than a third of its hospitals are private equity-owned. Since 2005, close to 200 rural hospitals have fully or partially closed. More than 400, over 1 in 5, are currently at risk of following them. This story is still being written, right now, in 2025 and 2026. In 2025, Oregon passed the first law of its kind in the country, banning what's called the corporate practice of medicine, meaning only licensed healthcare professionals, not outside investors, can hold a controlling stake in a medical business. Massachusetts passed its own law forcing private equity firms to disclose healthcare transactions to state regulators before they happen. Both laws exist because of Steward. Lawmakers are, for the first time, actually trying to close this loophole before the next hospital collapses. But remember Rick Scott. The last time this exact pattern played out, the regulatory response eventually settled into a record fine, a guilty plea from the corporation, and a personal outcome for the man at the top that involved a governor's mansion and a Senate seat rather than any real consequence. Whether this round ends differently is, right now, an open question. There's one more layer to this business you should know about before we run the numbers, because it's the part that actually touches almost everyone watching this video, whether you've ever set foot in a private equity-owned hospital or not. Private equity doesn't just buy the buildings. Increasingly, it buys the doctors inside them. Firms have spent heavily acquiring physician staffing companies, the businesses that supply emergency room doctors, anesthesiologists, and radiologists to hospitals across the country, including hospitals those same firms don't technically own. Once a staffing company controls the emergency room at enough hospitals in a region, it gains enormous leverage over insurance companies during contract negotiations. And when a staffing company can't reach an agreement with your insurer, you can end up treated by an emergency room doctor who's technically out of network, even though you walked into a hospital that's fully covered by your plan. You didn't choose that doctor. You couldn't have. You were unconscious, or bleeding, or in the middle of a heart attack. And months later, a surprise bill arrives for thousands of dollars that has nothing to do with the hospital's own prices and everything to do with a staffing contract you never saw. Congress eventually passed federal legislation, the No Surprises Act, specifically to close this loophole, which tells you how widespread the practice had become before lawmakers stepped in. It's the same basic move as the sale-leaseback, just aimed at patients directly instead of hospital balance sheets. Find a structural gap nobody's watching closely, and extract value from it before anyone notices. Let's run the two scenarios, the same way we always do. Scenario 1. The play that works, for the owner at least. Buy a distressed hospital system for tens or hundreds of millions. Execute the sale-leaseback. Extract a massive dividend within a few years. Exit before the rent obligations catch up with the hospital's actual finances. Cerberus did this and walked away having nearly quadrupled its money. Leonard Green did it and walked away with $437 million. Rick Scott did an earlier version of it and walked away with a fortune, a governorship, and a Senate seat. Scenario 2. The play that collapses and takes the hospital down with it. The debt structure catches up before you exit. Vendors stop shipping supplies. Staff go unpaid. Adverse events climb. Patients suffer, sometimes fatally. And eventually you're the one being subpoenaed by the United States Senate, suing your own government to avoid testifying, while a $9 billion bankruptcy has your name attached to it. That's exactly what happened to Ralph de la Torre. The uncomfortable truth sitting underneath both scenarios is that the difference between them often has very little to do with how well or how badly the hospital was actually run day to day. It has to do with timing, whether the owner managed to extract the dividend and exit before the rent bill, the malpractice suits, and the bad headlines all arrived at once. The clinicians, the nurses, the patients in the beds, none of them get a vote on that timing. They just experience whichever scenario the ownership structure happens to land on. So here's the actual truth about buying a hospital. On paper, it looks like the one business in America where the customer has no choice but to show up. That's exactly what makes it look safe. And that's exactly what made it exploitable. Because it turns out the one asset nobody can walk away from, a hospital, a building full of people who have nowhere else to go, was also the one asset an owner could walk away from completely clean, yacht included, while the patients, the ones with genuinely nowhere else to go, were left holding the actual bill. Turns out the safest investment in America was never really about keeping the hospital alive. It was about knowing exactly when to leave before it died. And if history is any guide, it was also about knowing exactly when to plead the fifth. Because that's really the through line connecting a Nashville cardiologist chain in 1968, a Florida fraud case in 1997, and a bankrupt hospital system in 2024. The building changes, the city changes, even the specific financial trick changes from kickbacks to sale-leasebacks to staffing contracts. What doesn't change is the basic shape of the deal, an asset the public cannot walk away from, owned by someone who eventually can.